Ever since its miraculous birth, the world of Pokemon has only continued to grow, plagued by the most unbelievable creatures, more diverse than one can begin to imagine. But the original 151 accompanied us on our first steps in the series, a Pokédex that now causes division. The most nostalgic and attached section of the fandom claims that the Pocket Monsters have lost their essence after them, and that only the Pokemon of Kanto deserve to be called such. Among the most active fans, however, the prevailing discourse is that those 151 were actually simple, literal creatures, without much background compared to what would come later. It's time to find out who's right. Let's explain all the Pokemon, starting with Kanto today. This bestiary is opened by the original starters that welcome us to this unreal world. On the first page we find Bulbasaur, a small toad dinosaur hybrid, although its animal inspiration is least important. To understand the essence of its concept, we need to look at the plant on its back. In its first stage, it is evolved that as the Pokemon grows, it opens and develops into a stunning Rafflesia flower. Its Western name is quite literal, and far from symbolizing its mystery as well as the Japanese one. Fushigi-dane means strange, isn't it? And so it is. A creature of ambiguous species from which a magical flower grows is not something you see every day. But choosing something so bizarre as the first creature in the encyclopedia is a way of welcoming the player into a fantastic world where anything is possible. It is as if the very name and appearance of the first Pokemon invites you to wonder what kind of world is inhabited by such unusual creatures. Its flower is something to talk about. It hides a dark secret, but it shares it with another Pokemon, so we will leave that for later. For now, Charmander is the stereotypical representation of the salamander, an animal associated with fire since ancient times. Charmeleon and then Charizard. It's a logical progression of the family, combining the igneous lizard concept with western dragon traits and its ability to breathe fire. A progression that continues with that fantastic vase, but manages to feel biologically credible. Although I like all three equally, my pick tends to be Squirtle, which seems to break through this unreality. A small water turtle sounds pretty realistic. Well, yes, in the case of Squirtle, but both Wartortle and Blastoise, with their sturdier tube-like legs and shell shape, are much more reminiscent of land turtles, again creating that dissonance. Legend has it that some Wartortles have lived 10,000 years. This is not only an exaggeration of turtle longevity, but it also suggests a possible inspiration in Minogami, an ancient turtle that dragged algae in the shape of a tail. In the case of Wartortle, the algae would not only settle on its tail, but also on its head, simulating the appearance of a winged helmet, giving it a touch of the Nordic warrior ideal. A small hint of the war theme we could see in its final form. The formidable Blastoise is a turtle, war tank, and playing with language, a water tank. As this video is going to be long, we won't go into Mega or Gigantamax forms, but don't forget that there are similar videos to this one that analyze all these forms in depth in the channel. Caterpie is the first regional insect in the series and must be protected. But there's no much to say about this little fellow, as it is an almost exact representation of a caterpillar of different butterfly species. Not long after that, Caterpie becomes Metapod, another generic chrysalis, although its Japanese name is a pun on the word rucksack. Okay, I've already unlocked the need for one in the form of this Pokemon. When the cocoon opens, the butterfly is revealed, Butterfree. And here's where things get interesting. As you may know, Butterfree is not a psychic type, but it does have psychic powers. Not only it, but all the butterflies in the series seem to have an affinity with the psychic type. This is a reference to the fact that in ancient Greece, this animal was known as psyche, or soul. They saw butterflies as incarnations of departed spirits. Indeed, it is a cliche in popular culture to represent the departed souls in this form. Its counterpart, Weedle, is more interesting than it may appear. What looks like another little caterpillar is actually a wasp larva, a type of parasitic wasp that infects the body of a caterpillar. The host victim is kept alive and continues to behave normally until the larvae emerge from its body and knit it from the inside out. The brutal side of nature. This inspiration could explain why this Pokemon always coexist in the same areas. Although, fortunately, there is no indication that this happens in Pokemon. I'm not really ready to see Caterpie being devoured from the inside. Kakuna would be the pupal stage of the same wasp. And finally, Beedrill, which is clearly based on a giant northern hornet, not a bee as commonly believed. The two original bug-type lines are more than just visual representations of the creatures they inspired them. The stats change through their harden, the status condition, and the need to buy supplies with Weedle's poison. Even the evolution, fast and intuitive because of how it mimics real-life metamorphosis. Catching insects was the genesis of the idea for Pokemon, so it's nice that the first bug-type creatures have so much to teach us. Entering the Viridian Forest as a youngster confused by a new world, and leaving it as a trainer with all the letters. Pidgey, Pidgeotto, and Pidgeot are indeterminate birds with features of many different species, including Hawfinches, pigeons, cardinals, and eagles. Like many designs of this generation, they are an ambiguous and generic representation of avians with no clear single inspiration. Even their names are simply taken from the onomatopoeia of bird sounds in Japan. But perhaps they are not as ordinary birds as we thought. They could even be considered gods. The black markings around their eyes are reminiscent of various species, but also of the faces of Ra and Horus, the ancient Egyptian gods of the sky and the sun, two elements that could undoubtedly represent the flying type. As Mega Pidgeot in battle, it blasts heat waves and hurricanes with perfect accuracy, like the guardian of the sky and the sun. But it does not stop there, as in the progression of its line we can see how its hairstyle seems to resemble more and more the pictorial representation of these deities. And finally, in its Mega Evolution, the shape that is drawn with one of its tresses, it's reminiscent of the crowns of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And that's not all, because what if I told you that Raticate is not a rat? Or at least it is only partly. Rattata is a rat, and its incisors keep growing throughout its entire life, forcing it to keep biting to file them down and stay healthy. Raticate, however, is more closely related to a guinea pig, or more likely, a muskrat. Despite its name, this species is not a member of the genus Rattus. Several Pokédex entries describe it as an excellent swimmer, and if it can learn surf, it might even be close to another. Their Alola versions are much more interesting, but again, there are specific videos on the channel for all these variations. Spearow and Fearow distinguish themselves by being much more temperamental and aggressive than the other Kanto birds. Fearow even has a crest that resembles a rooster, but could also be seen as a typical punk hairstyle, in accordance with its strong character, hence the Oni of its Japanese name. Ekans is a rattlesnake-colored snake hybrid. Funnily enough, the Pokédex lists its main characteristic as being very stealthy, which seems odd given the sound that its tail would presumably make when it moved. At a modest level of 22, it becomes the fearsome Arbok, itself a hybrid of many snake species, including cobras, boas, pythons, and anacondas. Arbok's most characteristic feature is the pattern on its belly, which simulates a terrifying face warning of danger. As an additional fact, the Pokédex states that the horrible drawings on its skin can vary from area to area, with up to 6 variations found. In fact, we see different variations of the shapes in the sprites of different generations, although with the advent of 3D models, the fun is over. Pikachu is now one of the most famous fictional characters in the world and the visible face of the franchise, but long before its rise to fame, it was conceived as just another creature to populate the Pokédex, a particularly casual, mundane one, I may add. According to its creator, Atsuko Nishida, she simply wanted to make a small electric Pokemon in the shape of a dessert. As an electric Pokemon, the idea was that it would feed on electricity and store it in its cheeks, just like squirrels fill their cheeks with food. The lighting bolt shape of its tail and its yellow coloring were just additional touches to emphasize its electrical affinity. These are all rather random features that would forever define Pikachu as a universal icon. Even its name, which comes from the Japanese onomatopoeia of the sound of electricity and that of small animals, was given without much thought, according to Atsuko herself. Who would have thought that it would become one of the most recognized names in the world and one of the few that has not been translated into any language? That's how great things happen, often by accident. Raichu's body is stylized to resemble a gerbil or a kangaroo rat, but the rest of its features share its electric origins. Its ears might be a nod to King, an electric monster from the Ultraman franchise that has influenced Pokemon for generations. Other Pokemon listed as mice in the Pokédex are Sandshrew and its evolution Sandslash, but that's not very accurate. They have rodent traits, but their main inspiration is the pangolin. It is the only mammal with scales, making it a very special animal. This stick to its body like plates, and when threatened, it curls up into a ball, just like this line. This suggests that the main idea of this line is defense itself, as Sandshrew has a structure with its scales that makes it look like a living wall. Its evolution takes on many porcupine-like features, but conceptually it is as if spikes and obstacles have been added to the wall to make it much more impregnable. The Nidorina line is one of the most special of the generation, perhaps the most representative species of what pocket monsters were originally intended to be. Monstrous creatures, reptilian but ambiguous and without a closest species. Not to mention their status as pioneers of the genre mechanics that would be officially introduced in the next generation. Both forms are based on rabbits and orchids, as can be seen from their color and the fact that the flower has some poisonous parts. Specifically, there's a variety called Moon Orchid, which suggests this line's connection to the moon, in addition to the fact that rabbits themselves are closely associated with the moon in Japan. And all of the Pokemon that evolve with the Moonstone in this generation have traits of this animal. Nidorino and Nidorina start looking like small rhinos, and their venom increases, especially when they feel threatened and release more adrenaline. And these two things may be related, as the rhino is on the verge of extinction due to the hunting for its horns for the pharmaceutical industry, and in order to prevent this hunting, the possibility of injecting poison into its horns has been raised. In fact, this project dates from 2019, 23 years after this line was created, but you have to admit Sugimori's prediction was epic. When these two Pokemon are finally exposed to the Moonstone, Nidoking and Nidoqueen, monstrous, slightly humanoid, dinosaur-like rhinoceroses are born. They follow and exploit all their previous inspirations, although Nidoking also bears a strong resemblance to Baragon, a character from Godzilla. Clefairy also has a strong affinity with the lunar world. In fact, she is believed to be a fairy who was born in the moon and came to Earth in a meteorite. In traditional fables and popular culture, fairies have a strong relationship with the moon and the stars. In fact, the clearest and most recognizable element of their design is the star shape, which combines all the features associated with the night sky. Both Clefairy and Clefable were the first Pokemon specifically designed to be cute and cuddly, as the original idea of pocket monsters was to be much rougher, violent, and intimidating creatures. It was a change of direction that would eventually lead to a franchise of much greater richness and variety, so there is much to be grateful for in this line. Vulpix and Ninetales are the ultimate manifestation of this diversity, creatures of delicate and graceful appearance, but not free from danger. Based on Kyubi no Kitsune, or the nine-tailed fox, it is shown how the tails grow on this creature as it accumulates years and resentment towards humans. Vulpix, with only 6, could retain a certain innocence and a sweet and friendly character, but Ninetales, with 9, would have reached the maximal level of power and malice. It has all sorts of supernatural abilities, and its vengeful character comes from all the time it has lived, which has allowed it to observe the true nature of humans. The negative energy it has accumulated inside it, so great that it is said that touching one of its tails will curse the offender with 1,000 years of misfortune. Surprisingly, however, it may even accompany a pure heart trainer. Then, and only then, will it be a fiercely loyal ally. Jigglypuff is the last Moonlight Pokemon in the Pokédex. It, and especially its evolution, Wigglytuff, are also slightly rabbit-inspired. Its Japanese name, Pudindin, refers to something sweet, maybe referring to the mochis that such rabbits are said to make on the moon. Hence its round appearance, which could also be a direct reference to the full moon, with the face and eyes so characteristic of children's drawings. Since the second main concept of this line seems to be childhood, its lunar concept may also be related to the fact that this Pokemon is characterized by its lullabies, materialized in its ability to put its opponents to sleep. The puff in its name is the onomatopoeia for falling asleep standing up, but also for blowing, which adds another layer of meaning to the line, which is also based on balloons. All childish and innocent concepts to many references, masterfully brought together. Now Zubat, contrary to what its detractors may think, is a very interesting depiction of bats, a common race in RPGs. It is known that these bats, which do not have very good vision, are guided by ultrasound. That's why Zubat has no eyes, and its supersonic move misses more than it hits. But with effort and persistence, it will become a Golbat, much more infallible with its Confuse Ray, based on a Megabat, which, guess what, has much better vision. Oddish is a peculiar wandering plant that hides underground during the day, but comes out at night to the call of the moonlight. You may think that such a psychedelic idea is a product of the consumption of its leaves, but surprisingly, it was inspired by a real plant, which is also steeped in myth, the mandrake, a poisonous and medicinal plant whose use dates back to ancient times. Just as Oddish is a plant with small legs, they have very thick roots that resemble humanoid legs. For this reason, they were once seen as mythological plant-animal hybrids that, under the right conditions, could turn into goblins and bring good fortune to those who encountered them. But there was also great danger in them. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that a mandrake could only be picked in the light of the moon, otherwise it would scream until the person was driven mad. Oddish, in its simplicity, brings all these elements together. Its association with moonlight, its real little paws, even its screams. The Pokédex tells us that it is sometimes mistaken for a clump of weeds, and that it emits a blood-curdling scream when pulled up. But what about its evolutions, Gloom and Vileplume? Well, according to the Pokédex, their flowers could be based on the Rafflesia, just like Venusaur. The Rafflesia breaks a lot of the rules we associate with flowering plants, but its most surprising feature is that instead of being a chlorophyll feeder, it is parasitic. Its roots burrow into the tissues of other plants and suck their nutrients. Not to mention its other atypical feature for a flower, the smell of rotting flesh. They are popularly known as zombie flowers, and if we look at the faces of Gloom and Vileplume, fits the name zombie plants quite well. Now we can understand the dark secret we were anticipating for Venusaur. It also has a large Rafflesia on its back, but while Vileplume is the flower, Venusaur could be a being parasitized by it, stealing its energy and nutrients, hence the sickly and decadent face the Pokemon takes on as it grows. a phenomenon similar to the next Pokemon in the Pokédex, although this one takes it to even more horrific places. Paras, a small insect crab hybrid that lives in damp forests. But it is precisely because of the dampness of their habitat that mysterious fungi often appear on their backs, parasiting the Pokemon and stealing some of its nutrients, developing little by little and stealing more and more food until the original Pokemon dies of starvation. Parasect is the cadaver of Paras, controlled by the fungus, which overdeveloped until it gained consciousness and became the Pokemon. Another zombie, basically, but not the Western idea of a zombie, but the Chinese zombie, which comes from a fungus that is born in the corpse and controls it. The next one, Venonat, is also related to parasites, which is interesting because the Pokédex entries seem to have a certain thematic order. It's cute and reminiscent of a flea or a mite, but the most striking thing about it is its huge compound eyes, which act like radars capable of emitting beams of light. Light, of course, has to do with its evolution, Venomoth, to which it is attracted, as a poisonous moth, although its fangs could be a reference to the vampire moth. Diglett is one of the simplest but most ingenious designs of the original 151. It is a cartoon mole, or rather an arcade mole. The original Whack-A-Mole game was designed as a kind of representation of repetitive and endless tasks, giving a sense of accumulation rather than progress. This is reflected very well in its habitat, the Diglett's cave, where this Pokemon never stops bothering you, even more so in the remakes where its ability prevents you from escaping. Just as the arcade depends on the player's speed and reflexes with the deck, Diglett is very fast, and the trio simply represents a higher level of the game in that there are many moles and they spawn faster, being one of the fastest Pokemon of the original 151. Meowth is a Maneki Neko, the well-known lucky cats that are said to attract good luck and financial success. This is reflected in its payday move, which it uses to attack and drop coins, as it is attracted to round, shiny objects and is eager to snatch and collect them. Paradoxically, this is a Pokemon that is seen as vulgar and frowned upon by the affluent classes. That is, until it becomes a Persian, the most common pet of the wealthy classes, which makes me wonder if only a few people trust this Pokemon, but every time it attacks, it multiplies the income of its trainer. It would be not surprising to be found commonly among the wealthy, as they were rewarded for being among the few who were interested in training this Pokemon. Which came first, the cat or the millionaire? Psyduck is a duck whose color and roundness remind me of the typical rubber duck in a bathtub. Now I can't help thinking that its constant headaches are due to the gesture of squeezing its head to make knots. But biologically, its headaches are caused by a great latent mental force that gives it terrible migraines. To avoid them, it tries to keep its mind blank for as long as possible, hence its carefree and goofy character. As Golduck evolves, no longer suffers from these headaches, so it can be inferred that it has much greater mental control, and is also inspired by the mythological Kappa, who had psychic powers. What do they have in their heads not to give it the psychic type? Especially when the golden color of its name is associated with such psychic powers in Japan. Well, we kinda find an explanation in its great talent. Golduck is the best swimmer in the Pokemon world, and its forehead glows during its activity. Perhaps swimming is a form of meditation for it, a way of opening its third eye, connecting with the present by expressing itself in every movement. Headaches are indeed a common symptom in those who suffer from chronic stress, and this kind of activities that allow you to get in the zone are the best medicine for it. Golduck would express its extrasensory potential by swimming so that its headaches would disappear. Let's say its water type already included its psychic powers. Mankey is a macaque-pig hybrid. As far as I know, there is no such thing as a big-nosed monkey, so I like to think that the inspiration for this Pokemon was a primate called the snub-nosed monkey, a species that, apart from having a very funny name, is unique to China and is characterized by the gesture of sinking its head between the shoulders, which fits the morphology of Mankey, who basically has its face inside its torso. The Pokemon's main characteristic is that it has a very, very bad temper. And when it evolves into Primeape, it goes to the extreme of spending most of its life angry. Anger accelerates its heart rate and hormonal response to sometimes dangerous levels, and it's not uncommon for this Pokemon to die from this constant stress, creating a new species in the process, as we saw with the ghastly Annihilate in the video with the entire Pokédex of Paldea. While fighting types usually represent a particular fighting style, martial art, or physical ability, Primeape would be the embodiment of someone who is just unable to control their emotions, who adopts violent and aggressive behaviors, and who will sooner or later get into trouble. It even has something resembling shackles or handcuffs, as if they had tried to lock him up, but since it is such an uncontrollable force, it would have been useless. Until recently, Growlithe and Arcanine were considered legendary Pokemon. Unsurprisingly, they were inspired by Shisha statues, hybrids of dog and lion known for their loyalty and protection of sacred temples, hence their mystical nature and protective personality. Poliwag is small. As a tadpole, a creature whose intestines show through, it has to use the spiral of its belly to hypnotize its predators. The spiral also draws a whirlpool, giving it a double meaning with its water type. As Poliwhirl and Poliwrath, the concept remains the same, but something interesting is that it's still a tadpole instead of a frog, as could be logical. This could be due to neoteny, a fairly common phenomenon in amphibians, where a tadpole keeps growing without ever metamorphosing until it becomes a mega tadpole. Given that the King's Rock found in other regions allows the leader Poliwhirl's crown with it to achieve a more natural evolution, and given the unnaturalness of this Pokemon, which seems to have simply overdeveloped abnormally, is it really a mutation resulting from an attempt to force the evolution of species that are not destined to do so? Abra, Kadabra, and Alakazam are the mystical psychic prodigies of the first generation. Abra is a child who begins to stand out for its supernatural intelligence. It is shy and introverted, like the stereotype of the prodigy who avoids contact, which is reflected in its signature teleport. Kadabra would have motifs on its body from the cards used to detect people's psychic powers, so it would be the same prodigy who was tested to see if there really was something paranormal about him. There are even Pokédex entries about a child who woke up transformed into this Pokemon. I always thought that this was just a horror story from the Pokemon world, but looking at the origin of the line, maybe the child thing refers to Abra itself? As a Alakazam, it could take on the appearance of a great sorcerer with its archetypical mustache. It could also be interpreted as a wizard who uses these objects to prepare concoctions in his cauldron. Although, as most of you know, it is also a caricature of Uri Geller, an inspiration which, in retrospect, seems rather secondary, but that would end up embroiling this line in controversy. Machop is its great rival. Although they are not usually seen as such, they are two opposing lines, and just as Abra was a child prodigy because of its mental strength, Machop would be the typical kid who stands out as a physical prodigy from an early age. Stronger than most adults, full of energy, he would excel at any sport or physical activity. This prodigious genes would materialize as he grows into Machoke, a poke bodybuilder of unprecedented brute strength, pushing the limits of his body to the point where his arms began to crack, based on overtraining, muscle injuries, and tears, but also extreme muscle definition that bodybuilders seek. by reducing fat and stretching muscle fibers and striations. As for Machamp, it seems that he could use the energy of the Pokemon trait as a catalyst to better control this force, so that it would stop hurting itself, its injuries would heal, and it could grow 2 more arms? Does this energy act as a kind of doping agent for this Pokemon? One that pushes muscle growth to the limit so it creates new muscles? Even so, its size is smaller, which could be a metaphor for a higher level athlete who has put aesthetics aside and pursued his own ideal of strength. Bellsprout, Whipping-Bell, and Victreebel are based on a genre of carnivorous plants called pitcher plants. Their leaves are designed to hide their mouths, which, as in their inspiration, will trap any poor prey that unknowingly falls into them, dissolving with the acid the Pokemon secretes inside before being swallowed. Bellsprout is the only one of the 3 with legs, which not only gave us great moments, but also makes him very similar to the Mandrake we saw in Oddish, which makes sense if they are counterparts. It is possible that the 2 Kanto basic Pokemon plants have some sort of common ancestor. Tentacool and Tentacruel are hybrids of jellyfish and squid. Tentacruel also resembles several varieties of the godly-eyed monster and other violent alien invaders from the 50s B movies, as evidenced by its ability to shoot lasers from the gems in its head. The Geodude lines are rocks with arms. It used to strike me as one of the worst designs, but I've grown so fond of it lately that it made me think, and well, let's just say there's a clear idea behind it. You all know the saying about stumbling over the same stone twice, right? Well, here we have a stone that has come to life to make you stumble as much as possible. Like Zubat, I think this goes back to the original idea that Pokemon that frequent caves should be annoying and make the path tortuous. Graveler and Golem are larger rocks that would optimize their structure to roll, in line with that idea of a stone chasing you. Ponyta and Rapidash are a small igneous pony and a majestic fire unicorn horse, respectively. Rapidash is most notable for his competitive nature. Whenever it sees someone running, its flames flicker and it tries to overtake them. Now, Rapidash is not the only fire horse we see in anime and Japanese pop culture, which invites the thought that there must be some cultural origin we are missing that inspires these creatures. In fact, the Chinese zodiac is represented by animals and elements, and of all the combinations, the 1966, the year of the fire horse, is considered the most unlucky of all. So bad that the birth rate plummeted to avoid bad luck for the newborns. But what could this have to do with Rapidash, a symbol of strength in the Pokemon world? Well, several entries tell how Ponyta is born as a very weak Pokemon with no leg strength to even stand up, but through willpower becomes a powerful being with an unbreakable spirit. So maybe they wanted to tell us the story of a brave Pokemon who had everything stacked against it, but was not afraid to defy its fate in order to fulfill its dreams. Slowpoke is a mysterious creature with features somewhere between a hypo and an otter, and it happens to be one of the smartest Pokemon in the world, but it's very absent-minded and lazy, so it doesn't make the most of its intelligence. So lazy that it has become a trend to cut off its delicious, nutritious tail, often without the Pokemon even noticing. Fortunately, it has the ability to regenerate its tail, but often this carelessness happens in the sea, where its tail is submerged, attracting the hungry shelters who love its taste, like its true inspiration, Kawauso, another yokai disguised as a fisherman. The mollusk, hungry and attracted attracted by the sweet and nutritious tail of Slowpoke, attaches itself to it and injects its toxins in an attempt to paralyze its body and eat its tail. Apparently, this situation has happened many times, as Slowpoke has the habit of putting its tail underwater like a fisherman. So many times, in fact, the Slowpoke would begin to develop a resistance to these toxins, which could end up not being dangerous to it, but anesthetizing it and making it impervious to pain. Magnemite and Magneton are generally thought of as a group of magnets brought to life by the electromagnetic activity of their place of origin, but there are indications that this is a misconception, and that they are actually much more mysterious beings. Their original red and blue Pokédex says that they usually appear when sunspots are burning, and Stadium says of Magnemites that they appeared out of nowhere. All this suggests that the original concept was that of UFOs. Magnezone makes it much clearer, don't you think? Farfetch or Kamonegi is a silly Pokemon that literally translates a Japanese saying, Kamoga negi wo shotekuru, or a duck arriving with scallions, a phrase used when something so stupidly convenient happens that it seems like a joke. Ducks themselves, both in Japan and in many parts of the world, represent naivety and thoughtlessness. There could be no clearer representation of this stereotype than Farfetch, a Pokemon considered a delicacy that walks around with a leek as a weapon is not only a stupid and useless weapon, but would also serve as a side dish when cooked. Finding one is the best luck a predator can have, so its characteristic object and movements are also associated with luck and critical hits. Doduo and Dodrio have features of the extinct dodo and an ostrich, but why do they have multiple heads? Well, Kanto is all about human technology, and as we shall see, genetic mutation is a recurring element in this Pokédex. The fact that Doduo looks like a newborn chick seems to indicate that the bird was born with a deformity that grew larger and larger, sprouting more and more heads. Given the bird it was based on, it could come to represent the dangers of playing God, for example, by bringing back extinct species caused by humans themselves, who seem to believe that they have the power to do and undo as they please. One thing Dodrio stresses a lot is its expressions. One face is always happy, one is always angry, and one is always sad. This could be based on another Japanese saying that we all have three faces. One is the one we show to the world, another is the one we show only to those closest to us, and the last one we don't let anyone see. The same cannot be said for Seel and Dewgong, which are beautiful but probably the most literal and boring designs in the Pokédex. Pre-evolution and evolution are a young sea lion and a merman or dugong, respectively. Even their names have been changed that much. Grimer and Mach, on the other hand, could be further evidence of the havoc humans are wreaking on their environment, proliferating in major urban centers, including dumping in steams like the one outside the Rocket Game Corner in Celadon City. It grows up feeding on rubbish and debris, and judging by their three-fingered hands and the desperate pose in which they are usually drawn, it is most likely inspired by Dorotabo, a three-fingered yokai that emerged from the mud of neglected rice paddies. Shelder is a small oyster that lives in the depths of the sea. Its tongue is actually its food, a part of the body that some mollusks use to move around, which looks a lot like a tongue sticking out of its shell. We have already talked about its mutualism with Slowpoke, but if this is not the case, and Shelder has optimal growth in the deepest part of the sea, conditions that can be replicated with a water stone, which seems to concentrate the same energy, it can become a cloister, based on the evolved mollusks of the genus Spondylus, whose colorful spiky shells are sold as luxury ornamentals. The fact that Ghastly appears immediately after in the Pokédex is suspicious. species. It is said to be the gaseous incarnation of a person's or Pokemon's soul, like Hitodama, a yokai in the form of a gaseous ball born from the body of a newborn person who would horribly turn into a ghost baby. Haunter could be a more mature ghost, more like classic Western ghost iconography, with dangling hands and a somber expression. Like them, Gengar perfects its own nature to make its victim live the worst nightmare imaginable. It could become a representation of your own shadow stalking you. The rest is left to imagination. Onix is one of the most surprising cases in the entire Pokédex. I know what you're thinking. What could be surprising about a silly rock snake with disappointing statistics for its size and looks? Well, to understand, you might want to consider looking at this Pokemon's most famous trainer, Brock from Pewter City. His rock-decorated gym may look shabby and simple, but it is much deeper than it appears, with materials and arrangements that are clearly inspired by a Zen garden or Kare-san-sui. This style was mainly adopted by Zen temples and is the place of meditation par excellence for Buddhist monks. Is Brock a Buddhist? Maybe, and his ace, Onix, has a very strong inspiration in Zen Buddhism itself. As we can see, not only is it made of stones with a very specific distribution, following the theme of the architecture of the gym, but in all its sprites form a circle with its body, the main symbol of this school of Buddhism. The icing on the cake is that it is precisely because it is forming a circle of stones that Onix is very similar to a Buddhist rosary, or a mala rosary. To put it more finely, this Pokemon could symbolize the statue of a Naga, benevolent mythological creatures in the shape of a snake who, like Onix, lived underground in colossal palaces. Drowsy is one of the most literal species in the Pokédex, based on the Japanese Baku, dream-eating creatures with a hybrid appearance between pig and an elephant. Tapirs are directly called Baku in Japan, mixing myth and reality. The twist is that, as the Pokédex repeats and its appearance suggests, unlike the original Baku, Drowsy has a childish palate, abhors nightmares, and has a preference for the pure and innocent dreams of children. Hypnos becomes much more humanoid, representing the stereotypical hypnotist. Its skills as such have been perfected, and Drowsy's hypnotic arm dance has been replaced with a much more effective pendulum lull. Krabby is a crab, and Kingler is a bigger one. Like for more secret facts from the Pokemon world, well, Kingler has the word king in both its Japanese and Western names, and yeah, it is very similar to the famous royal crab, whose shell is full of spikes. Just as Kingler's spikes simulate a crown, life imitates Pokemon. Voltorb and Electrode are the mimics of the Pokemon world, classic role-playing enemies who disguise as bounties, usually trap chests in suspiciously convenient locations. The chests of the Pokemon world are Pokeballs. Incidentally, Voltorb is the 100th Pokemon in the Pokédex, which is fitting for a Pokeball, as it is the quintessential symbol of the franchise. But as we have seen, it could be also considered the chest Pokemon. And if we add a 0, do you know what the Pokemon number 1000 is? Execute is another of the great mysteries of this Pokédex. Are they X or seeds? You couldn't believe how divisive this topic has been in the fandom, but I finally figured it out. Both are partially correct. The Pokédex has always been extremely ambiguous, supporting one theory or another depending on the generation, so it could have been inspired all along by a common Japanese practice of using eggshells as small pots for plants. Evolving with the power of nature concentrated in the leaf stone, Executor could be based on the terrifying Ninmengyu, one of the most disturbing yokai, shaped like a tree with a multitude of fruits in the shape of human heads that never stop laughing eerily. Even if one of them falls to the ground and explodes, it could continue its macabre laughter. Now, the analysis of Cubone is a labyrinth. It is said that the skull it wears as a helmet and the bone it uses as a throwing weapon were part of the skeleton of its deceased mother. But since the introduction of breeding, this has been called into question, as any perfectly healthy female Marowak with all her bones in place can give birth to a Cubone who is nevertheless born with these elements. This leaves several possibilities. For example, that the Pokédex is, as is often said, a source of urban legends and inaccurate data, with the story of its mother's skeleton being Red's interpretation of the completion of its entry based on the orphaned Cubone he made in the Pokemon Tower. But the most famous theory in the Pokemon world suggests that perhaps Cubone is a mutation of another species, most likely Kangaskhan, which died before its offspring could fend for itself, forcing it to survive as best it could and changing its type due to the lack of nutrients and hostile environment. Marowak would not be the mother of Cubone, but the evolution of this new line, born from a specific and unexpected event. This theory may make sense in the context of the first generation, as the only Cubone that exists are in the Lavender Tower, but these Pokemon are definitely connected in some way, as it seems that of all the things they could do with the bone, they use it as a boomerang. You see, in the old days, the Australian Aborigines used boomerangs to hunt kangaroos, so maybe that's the key. We are told that Cubone uses the skull of its deceased mother, but it is not specified that the skulls were from her skeleton. Perhaps Cubone and Marowak are actually Kangaskhan hunters, using the skull and bones of their victims as armor. Then it would make much more sense that when a Marowak dies, Cubone inherits the armor made from the bones of the Kangaskhan her mother once haunted. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan are a kickboxer and a boxer, respectively, as their Japanese names, derived from two Japanese legends of these contact sports, would suggest. Now, Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan have nothing to do with their original reference, just a translation thing to adapt it to martial art figures better known in the West. Be thankful they didn't call it Hitmonoris or something. Also, Hitmonlee could be based on the Donasura, a deformed human figure with no head and a face on the torso. What has that got to do with kickboxing? Well, the head is very delicate and it's very easy for a bad punch to be fatal. More in the context of kickboxing, where the jaw is one of the points where a kick can be more effective to quickly reduce the opponent, so a kickboxer without a mouth, jaw, or even head would have a great advantage to become the ultimate champion, don't you think? As for Lickitung, because of its huge tongue, it is usually related to the Akame, a yokai who like to lick bathrooms, but the truth is there is not a single reference to that nasty habit in the Pokédex, and visually they have practically nothing to do with each other. Folklore aside, it looked like some sort of monstrous humanoid salamander, which could explain its flexible, powerful tongue, and with its screaming pink, could it have something to do with chewing gum, licking sweets? At the moment, it's the most mysterious Pokemon and the least likely to be completely understood. Coughing and wheezing are another line based on pollution. Toxic gases from the region's industrial zones could accumulate in this mysterious creature. We see that it has developed an extra head and an expression of suffering that is completely different from the happiness of coughing. Again, maybe representing mutations and the suffering and negativity that pollution brings. Mythologically, they could be based on the Akakuchi and Asukokoko, Japanese monsters that were basically floating heads in clouds of gas, one and several respectively, which are reflected in Pokemon and evolution in a very literal way. But let's go back to the real origin of it all. Yes, Rhydon was the first Pokemon to be created, the prototype of the pocket monsters, which, as you know, know was very different from what we could see in the future. Specifically, in one of the earliest interviews, Sugimori talked about how in the first batch of designs, they tried to create kaiju-like creatures with a certain air of hostility and relentlessness, but more cartoonish than the average enemy monster in fantasy RPGs, so that they could be seen as allies. Otherwise, both Rhydon and its offspring Rhyhorn are biologically similar to rhinoceroses. Chansey is an interesting amalgam of many ideas. The main concept is an approximation to the Pokemon world of the cleric archetype in the JRPGs, a character that deals with healing tasks. This can be seen in its disproportionate HP, a typical trait of the class, and its signature move, Soft Boil, which allows it to share its HP with another member of the team outside combat. Later, with the release of the anime, it could become more directly associated with Narcissus, but the other main basis of his concept is luck. It is one of the most difficult Pokemon in the game to find and catch, and requires a great deal of fortune. When you do, you get one of the rarest Pokemon and one of the mainstays of competitive play at the time. And even if you defeat it, you get a huge reward in experience. Even its name literally is lucky in Japanese. As for my child Tangela, this is another of the most mysterious first generation Pokemon. In the beta, it was called Medusa, suggesting a slight inspiration from the goddess of Greek mythology. Could be, although many of these names seem more like placeholders than anything else. Its grass type and various Pokédex entries suggest that its biology is closer to some sort of algae creeper. Add to that its boots, which suspiciously resemble what a human would wear, and the way its design hints at the mystery of its gaze in the shadows. I think this is another incarnation of the horror stories that could surely arise about such mysterious creatures, such as a child being trapped among plants, so entangled that it would be impossible to remove them, with the people no longer recognizing them and, over time, forgetting their original identity and becoming a Pokemon forever. Tangela is the perfect balance between being mysterious and slightly disturbing, but cute at the same time, which for me makes it more than any other Pokemon the essence of that enigmatic first generation, where everything was ambiguous and the world was still defining itself along with the player's footsteps. Kangaskhan is obviously a pair of Kangaroo and Brute, and we already mentioned the most interesting thing about the line in the Cubone section, but another cool feature of the Pokemon that is very often overlooked is that Kangaskhan was the first Pokemon to have a gender distinction besides the Nidoran line. This Pokemon is always female, and you might think that this was only from Gen 2, but that's not the case. It's not just that the female red kangaroo is the one carrying her young in the pouch. Even in Gen 1, the Pokédex refers to her as the mother. This is interesting because maybe some of you who played the first generation when it came out may have wondered at the time how it is possible for Kangaskhan to have a baby when they are all female. But the introduction of Pokemon breeding in the second generation would provide an answer to this. When two different species of Pokemon have a baby, the offspring will always be of the mother species. So you could say that Kangaskhan was a precursor of the breeding mechanic before it was officially introduced. Horsey and Seadra are obviously seahorses, but the most interesting thing about them is their story with the dragon type. Kingdrag would be introduced in the future as a new evolution of the line, but without getting ahead of ourselves. Even in Gen 1, the category in the Pokédex was Dragon, although they did not have this type, nor did they learn the only move of this type at that time, Dragon Rage. What's going on here? Well, in Japan, seahorses are literally called baby dragons. Goldeen is very similar to the Kohaku, the red and white variety of koi carp, although its Japanese name comes from the Tosa-king, to which it also bears some resemblance. Sea King is reminiscent of the Sankey variety, or perhaps an Oranda, wherever their name says. It is Goldeen that is known as the Queen of the Water for the elegance with which she displays her colorful fins, while Sea King has a more silly and broadish appearance. Staryu and Starmie are mysterious starfish with miraculous intelligence and regenerative powers. This, combined with their disturbing geometric appearance, has led many esoteric sources of the Pokemon world to claim that they are actually alien beings with the appearance of a starfish. Their psychic nature does little to dispel doubts. What could be the origin of this enigmatic Pokemon? Well, judging by the shape of their core, one possible inspiration for Starmie could be the emblem of the ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna. If so, theories that these Pokemon are not what they appear to be would make sense, as the Sumerians are famous for their great cultural advances, including their sophisticated knowledge of astronomy. There are also theories about how aliens interfered with their culture, rumors that may have inspired the Pokemon world's vision of these mystifying beings. Mr. Mime time, the most famous mime of the series. Well, it doesn't have much competition. It is the only one. Literally, in the first generation, you could only get one of these Pokemon per game by trading. In other words, it's not a common species to find in the wild. Add to that its disturbingly humanoid appearance, and I feel like, as we've seen with Tangela, there's something of a horror story to this Pokemon. It even appears in the same patch of grass in the second generation, as a talented human mime who began impersonating a Pokemon so authentically and for so long that it ended up becoming one. Scyther awaits as a jackpot in the bug catching contest, and as it can only be obtained in the Safari Zone in the first generation, it may be another non-native Pokemon from Kanto. Biologically, it is a cross between a dinosaur and a praying mantis, with scythe-like limbs. Sounds like a dangerous combination. The most interesting thing about this line is the dynamic we would see with its future evolutions, but there will be time to talk about that. Sadly, Jinx does not have any evolutions to analyze, and I say sadly as it is one of those designs which have greater depth than it looks. The main base, in my opinion, is an opera singer, with her armor-like clothes, her communication based on singing, of a complexity close to that of human being, and the poses of her sprites and artworks. It's not hard to imagine her as a Nordic princess from a Wagnerian epic, which also suits her ice type. From there, and going back to Japanese culture, it is very likely that she was inspired by both Yamauba and Yuki Onna, the former a grotesque-looking old woman with prominent lips and long platinum hair, wearing a red kimono, the latter the Japanese Snow Woman, inspiring her type and ability to incapacitate her rivals with a kiss. Speaking of Jinx, it would be a remiss of us not to mention the controversy surrounding this Pokemon, which was accused of blackface and racist stereotype. Either way, I always thought her dark face was probably just another case like Tangela or Shelter, a shadowy expression behind long hair to convey mystery and a slight sinister quality, which in Jinx's case could fit very well with those Japanese references to seductive and extremely dangerous beings. The mighty Electabuzz is a humanoid tiger with small antennae on its head, which, in addition to its great physical strength, give it the ability to feed on electricity and unleash powerful electrical attacks. For this reason, it prowls power stations, although it can usually be seen outdoors during storms, feeding on electricity. It is undoubtedly based on an Oni, powerful ogres dressed in tiger skin, hence their feline features, and culturally closely associated with Raijin, the god of thunder. Magmar, on the other hand, is another chimera with human, amphibious, avian, and reptilian characteristics. It is no secret that it is based on Karura, a divine creature with a human torso and a bird's head who could breathe powerful fiery flames. Jinx, Electabuzz, and Magmar are not part of the same line per se, but they share enough in common to be considered members of a trio, the masters of the elemental punches of the Kanto region. Their similarities include the fact that they're all based on very popular figures in Japanese culture, which may be why the three Pokemon were made to look humanoid, as if they were wearing the famous masks of their respective legends. Pinsir is a stag beetle with many similarities to Megalon, an insectoid kaiju with big pincers and a mouth full of pointed teeth that closely resemble pins. Even its eyes are reminiscent of its Mega Evolution, which to me reinforces the other major influence of this Pokemon, insect phobia. Its deadly claws and teeth, its aggressive nature, and its look of pure violence. It seems to be a creature that wants to express all the aspects of that fear that is so ingrained in people. All it has left to do is fly. Oops. Tauros is a cross between a bull and a bison. Its most peculiar feature is its tail, in the shape of several whips, with which it seems to whip itself, causing it to accelerate and launch even harder. This habit has led to the misconception that this Pokemon can only run in a straight line, but nothing could be farther from the truth, as in some regions, such as Alola, it is considered one of the best Pokemon to use as a mount. In this region, the Tauros are much calmer and friendlier due to the mild climate. Its female counterpart, Miltank, is not common in Kanto, so perhaps Tauros was imported from Alola itself, its original habitat where the Pokemon can develop normally, and the discomfort caused by the conditions in Kanto is what causes its irascibility and tendency to constantly whip itself. The origin of Magikarp and Gyarados is one of the most well-known and overused by Poketubers around the world, but in case you've been a swordfish since 2014 and never heard of it, they were inspired by the Chinese legend of the carp that jumped over the dragon's gate. It tells the story of a poor, weak carp that no one took notice of until one day set out to prove his courage to everyone. It swam against the current day and night despite constant ridicule until, with sweat and tears, it managed to climb a waterfall. The dragon's gate. The gods, impressed by its perseverance, decided to turn it into a mighty dragon that would soar through the skies. Gyarados could obviously be based on the dragon of the legend, which partly justifies its controversial flying type, as the story tells of the dragon proudly soaring the skies at the end, but it is also based on a koinobori, or traditional Japanese flying carp. Arriving at the sunset of the Pokédex, we have one of the most breathtaking stories in the franchise, Lapras, an extremely intelligent creature with the appearance of a marine dinosaur with overwhelming kindness. Lapras is willing to help everyone, both humans and the Pokémon carrying on its back. This kindness made it easy for humans to hound them, bringing the species to the brink of extinction. This is particularly interesting because years later, it was revealed that it was one of the first Pokemon to be designed, so it makes sense that such a kind Pokemon would be in danger in this early Pokédex of violent and grumpy Pokemon and trainers more akin to hunters. Since then, the Lapras have become much more fearful and distrustful. The remaining specimens usually hide in subways and inaccessible lakes, singing their melancholic song that can be mistaken for a cry. Lapras is clearly based on the Loch Ness Monster, which was once thought to be a specimen of a surviving colony of plesiosaurs, but given its shell and ice type, it seems more biologically inspired by Xuanggu, one of the four symbols of the Chinese constellations. It was depicted as a giant turtle with a coiled snake, representing water and winter, which explains the type and biology of this Pokemon. In any case, one of the more heartwarming details of the series is that the 7th generation entries states that since it became a protected species, its number has greatly increased, and it is no longer endangered. Another of Kanto's most intriguing mysteries is Ditto, with the most unique ability of any Pokemon, the power to mimic any cellular structure to become an exact replica of any other creature, not to mention how it originally appeared in the ruins of the old Pokemon Mansion laboratory. It seems that this creature is the byproduct of some kind of failed experiment, which managed to reproduce uncontrollably until it became a species present in all regions of the Pokemon world. But its origin is even deeper and more mysterious. The Nupepo, an amorphous mass of flesh that pretends to be a friend to get close to people, smiling and happy, only to suddenly reveal its true form and scare them to death. Ditto could also disguise itself as your friend, and when you are relaxed and ask why so quiet, it would reveal its disturbing smiley face, giving you a deadly shock. Many sources suggest that these creatures are born from the remains of dead flesh, which, if you ask me, fits too well with the theory that this Pokemon was born from the biological remains of the failed experiments to create Mewtwo. Eevee comes right after in the Pokédex, and I don't think that's a coincidence. It seems that they both share a certain instability in their genetic code, which in Eevee's case seems to be responsible for its evolution into different species. Its creator spoke in an interview about how he was asked to create a Pokemon that could evolve into different species. He explained how he thought it would be a good idea for Eevee not to be defined by a particular type or identified as a specific animal. Biologically, it has characteristics of cat, fox, duck, and so on, because the animal is not important. The controlling idea of this design is to be a blank canvas to represent the phenomenon of evolution itself. This genetic malleability, when exposed to evolutionary stones, would evolve into beings that retain this ambiguity but distilled in one direction to represent these three types: a cat and mermaid hybrid with Vaporeon, a porcupine that generates enormous static electricity from the friction of its quills with Jolteon, and the most ambiguous of all with Flareon, a dog-rabbit-lion hybrid that stores high temperatures in its inner pouch and dissipates it throughout its soft fur. Porygon is a cyber Pokemon that again combines several ideas. It is an artificial creature developed by Silphco that resembles a dog with flattened edges. The joke is that it looks at the same time like an origami bird and an old 3D model of a very rudimentary technology with very few polygons. It is a deliberately ironic Pokemon, but it seems that during the development of Pokemon Red and Green, many people told Tajiri that the game was taking so long to make that it would be more cost-effective to make it in 3D for next generation consoles. In response to this comment, Porygon was included, a sarcastic Pokemon based on 3D polygons, but created in pixel art. But for now, it's a nice touch that this Pokemon's cry was the only one that wasn't replaced with the advent of 3D models, keeping this anachronistic technology in the game. We next come to the first fossils in the series, with Ammonite, who's based on an extinct mollusk called Ammonite, whose shell-shaped fossils are incredibly well preserved to the point where they are used today to other fossils. In life, they look like a kind of squid with a shell. Unlike Ammonite and Omastar, they hunted small fishes and crustaceans moving through the sea using powerful jets of high-pressure water that they could shot. Meanwhile, Kabuto and Kabutops are based on the famous horseshoe crab, a species that still exists today. So why would they be chosen as inspiration for an extinct Pokemon? It turns out that these creatures are known to be among the living species that have undergone the fewest visible changes in their 200 million years on Earth. They are commonly referred as living fossils. Another clear inspiration for them, judging by their name, are the Kabuto Samurai Helmet, which bear a certain resemblance to both the arthropod and the Pokemon, especially when you consider Kabutops' fighting style, that it could be considered the proto-samurai Pokemon from prehistoric times. Aerodactyl is the last fossil of the generation, and based on a pterodactyl, there doesn't seem to be much reason for its rock type other than the residue of an imperfect revival process. There was a lot of speculation that its Mega Evolution would restore the original appearance and power of the Pokemon, but judging by the fact that it retains its rock type, that it seems unlikely that it could have had it at the time, and that it could have developed its skeleton in such a horrific way. Mega Aerodactyl seems to be a form that takes it even further away from its original essence. From the videos I have uploaded on the subject, I have seen that a lot of people think that these harmful effects of Mega were a Game Freak excuse to remove Mega from the field and introduce new mechanics, and I could agree with that theory if it weren't for the fact that, in many cases, like Aerodactyl, it's something that can be clearly seen in its design. Its damn skeleton develops to the point where it goes through its skin and muscles. Arriving at Route 12, we find Snorlax. According to Game Freak, was inspired by staff member Koji Nishino, apparently a guy who was always eating and sleeping, hence the Pokemon's behavior. This appearance and habits also bear some resemblance to years in hibernation, you know, the process by which this and other animals increase their food intake to store as much fat as possible, and then, when winter comes, minimize their vital functions to conserve energy and survive the long winters when food is scarce. And with that, we have finally arrived at the OG legendary trio. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres could naturally be inspired by legendary bird myths from around the world. Articuno is the most interesting of the three, as it is undoubtedly based on the Aosagibi, blue fire heron, a legend that tells how some birds, when they reach an advanced age and great wisdom, begin to emanate a blue glow and develop shiny scales that merge with their feathers, spreading a bright dust wherever they go. Sounds like the literal description of Articuno, doesn't it? Zapdos and Moltres, on the other hand, were inspired not by a phenomenon or event, but by specific mythical birds. The former, the Thunderbird, of certain indigenous peoples of North America. With Moltres, the same thing would happen, being an amalgamation of several myths of legendary birds associated with fire, the phoenix, but above all, Suzaku, the vermilion bird of the Chinese zodiac. It symbolized summer, just as we could draw a parallel between Zapdos, representing spring and its thunderstorms, and Articuno representing the icy winter, leading us to wonder for spring, a fourth mythical bird was originally intended. In Pokédex order, the first dragons of the series are Dratini, Dragonair, and Dragonite, which has always fascinated me. As you know, these Pokemon are not considered legendary, but let's take a moment to think about what a legendary was back then. Far from the transcendental deities that would come in the future, we see much more earthly beings with surprising powers, inhabiting remote places, only accessible to the most intrepid adventurers, or even completely unknown. How far is Dragonite from this original legendary idea? Its strength is even greater than that of the three birds, and its rarity is not far off. This would change in later generations with the introduction of the Dragon's Den and the normalization of the species, but in these early versions, the game's lore directly refers to it as a mythical Pokemon, telling us that its existence was only recently discovered by a fisherman who stumbled upon it. Not to mention the fact that such a difficult and slow-to-train creature could reach maturity at level 55, something that was unprecedented in the original 151. And of course, it was the only Pokemon of the most canonically powerful type. even at the cost of deliberately omitting some. I think it would not be entirely unreasonable to consider Dragonite line in the context of this first generation as legendary Pokemon, or at least the closest to it among the so-called pseudo-legendaries. Dratini and Dragonair are probably based on Imuji, a Korean snake-like proto-dragon that lives in water or caves. When it has lived for 1,000 years, a jewel called Yuju falls from the sky. If the Imuji catches it, it transforms into a complete dragon. The jewels on Dragonair's neck and tail could also be a reference to the association of Chinese dragons with pearls. Finally, Mewtwo was created with the idea of being the most powerful Pokemon of all. That was the seed of its concept, and they built its whole story around it. It always seemed odd to me that they choose to make a Pokemon with its characteristics. You would think of another dragon or some other more cliche idea for the most powerful Pokemon, but apparently they went to the route of making it an alien-looking creature. Probably the biggest influence in this decision was the Earthbound franchise and its character, Gigas, the universal cosmic destroyer. The resemblance is undeniable. Mew, on the other hand, would have a more embryonic design. This is more evident in its early sprites and also explains the transparent bubble-like protective layer it seemed to be covered in the first film, which, as you know, makes all the sense in the world as the new species Pokemon, the embryo of everything we know today as pocket monsters. However, there are still some aspects of its history and concept that remain a mystery to this day. Without going into too much detail in this video, one of the biggest twists in the franchise in recent years has been the recent revelation that Mew was designed after Mewtwo, rather than the other way around as we always thought. Sure, you already know that story of how it was added at the last moment, but apparently it went much farther than that. Who knows if Mewtwo wasn't originally intended to be a clone or a genetic experiment, just an alien or a mutant as we've seen, but when the decision to introduce this little fellow was made as a secret Pokemon hidden in the cartridge with a design that was a simplified version of the last Pokemon in the Pokédex, the history of the first generation and its legendary Pokemon was rewritten to accommodate this last-minute change. The end result is that although Mewtwo is canonically a clone of Mew, conceptually the opposite is true. Mew was designed as a small clone of Mewtwo, introduced on a hunch for no apparent reason. The rest is history.